The left has not failed, and that is one of the greatest disasters ever to befall the working class. A lot of people think that the left is the movement of the working class for socialism. Nothing could be further from the truth. Left-wing politics are simply an updated version of the bourgeois democratic politics of the French Revolution, supplemented a lot of the time by a state capitalist economic programme, or by social capitalism. In the French Revolution, the up-and-coming capitalist class were confronted not only by the old order, but also by a large and growing urban population, the working class in formation, artisans, petty traders and the like, who had their own, often ill-informed though genuine aspirations for freedom from exploitation and oppression. This section of the populace presented a genuine threat to the Republicans and the power they lusted after. Bourgeois so-called democracy was the device that enabled the capitalist class to disguise their own aspirations for power as the liberation of everyone outside the feudal power structure. The notion of the people as though different classes, exploiters and exploited, could be reduced to a single entity was mystically torn out from the ether. And so one of the most successful and sustained political cons of all time started its programme of drawing the fangs of the malcontents, rebels and egalitarian elements amongst those that were exploited by, rather than benefactors of, capitalist economics. The notion of equality and the notion of rights possessed by all presented a fictitious view of society as a mass of individuals involved who all stood in the same relations to the law, completely ignoring the differences between the property owners and those whose labour they exploit. Above all, this was positioned by the umbrella construct known as the nation, the device used to persuade the oppressed class that they should identify with their oppressors who live in the same geographical area or speak the same language, and see as alien those of our class who are on the other side of national borders. By means of this devious and calculated illusion, capitalism was able to dominate the consciousness of the newly forming working class and others pressed down by the weight of its stinking thumb. Bourgeois democracy is nothing more or less than one enormous fucking lie embellished by countless other lies. As capitalism develops more and more, the material position of the working class forced it to engage in struggle despite its bourgeois consciousness, thus enabling this consciousness to be undermined. The existing capitalist regimes often came to be hated. Thus there was a need for a more radical appearing version of bourgeois so-called democracy with a more specifically working class image. Left-wing politics fulfilled this role in the 19th and 20th centuries, first in the form of social democracy or labourism, and then in the form of Bolshevism. Both of these variants managed to dress up support for capitalism in working class language and became major players in the full development of capitalism. This was especially true in the Soviet Union, where state capitalism was introduced by the Bolsheviks, a supposedly working-class party whose higher-ranked members went on to become the new bourgeoisie. The term the left, or left-wing, originates from the times of the French Revolution and refers to those in the Estates Generales, the legislative assembly, who sat to the left of the monarch. So both the terms left and right refer to statist and authoritarian politics of one kind or another, and do not apply to anarchism, libertarianism, or even to communism, socialism, or any other egalitarian, anti-authoritarian philosophy, ideology or current. They are simply the left and right wings of capital, and so it remains to this day. Any honest evaluation of political history makes this abundantly clear. So-called right libertarians are in fact merely edgy conservatives who are authoritarian and reactionary, inconsistent to quite an astonishing degree with actual libertarianism. They have stolen the term libertarian and distorted and confused its meaning. They are not libertarian, they believe in corporatocracy, the corporate state. And the so-called left libertarianism also does not really exist for the reasons already given. In fact, this is also an oxymoron. There can be no libertarianism that advocates for any section of the political or ruling class. However, it is at least possible, and therefore a source of opportunity and hope for people who fall into these imaginary categories to have truly libertarian or anarchist traits and beliefs. So what does leftism or left-wing politics consist of? At first blush it seems to be about supporting the struggle of the workers, but when you look more closely, everything is on the terrain of capitalist politics. The main features of leftism are as follows. Support for social capitalism. Using misleading and inaccurate terminology such as socialist and socialism to describe themselves and their policies, pledging to reform capitalism into a viable alternative to neoliberalism, and to bring about a socially centred, so-called kinder form of capitalism. They claim they will recuperate what has been lost due to neoliberalism, implying that the problem is simply that capitalism is being mismanaged. What they never do is deal with the many fundamental built-in problems of capitalism. Their programme only ever seeks to treat the symptoms, and of course they always fail to do so to any meaningful and sustained degree. Leftists, a truly ludicrous term, can be found on the left of the Labour Party, in the Green Party, also elsewhere on the supposedly radical left. But ultimately the kingpin of their political focus and proposed practice is parliamentary. Even so-called revolutionary groups who claim not to support the likes of the Labour Party or the Green Party still propose participation in Parliament, thereby helping in practice to uphold the ideology of bourgeois democracy. If social capitalists ever gain power, they always break their promises due to the stark realities of managing the capitalist system, and such parties around the world, once elected, have no choice but to do the dirty work of the capitalist class and implement harsh austerity on the working class, and run business as usual for the establishment, which of course they are a part of. Examples of this, such as Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain, did not fail the system, and once again the trance-inducing notion of political agency and power at the altar of the ballot box has excelled in its purpose of maintaining a docile, stupefied working class. Yes, the narrative around this practice is deeply religious. The entire history in government is that of attacking the living standards and rights of the working class, such as the Labour Party in Britain, the consistently toxic policies of who, over the years, since their inception, almost defy belief. Such political parties and politicians are a diversionary tool used by the capitalist class to divide, pacify, demoralise and depoliticise the working class. This despicable two-faced politics presents a so-called socialism that has only the interests of the capitalist class and its power-hungry lapdogs in Parliament at heart. Any participation in this pantomime does immense harm to the working class cause. That's the reality. At best, it is an act of political myopia. In effect, if not intention, it is an act of class treachery, really. Each time you vote, each time you campaign for a politician or a political party, you debase yourself and hand power to your class enemy. The enemy that stunts your creativity, decreases the possibilities of your life and crushes your individuality. You give that enemy permission to control everything you are, everything you do. Support for state capitalism. Already referred to, state capitalism, a term with various meanings, but here we mean the form of society that developed in the Soviet Union and its imitators. State capitalism collects all property into the hands of the state, and this is a capitalist state, not a so-called workers' state, because capitalist property relations still exist. Wage labour, money, the market, and of course, the workers do not control the state. The state, indeed, confronts the workers as the collective capitalist, extracting surplus value from them for the ruling bureaucrats, who are themselves the collective bourgeoisie. Let's be nice and sparkling clear about this. The only way capitalism can be dismantled is for the working class to immediately abolish money and the market and distribute goods according to need, albeit with scarce goods being rationed for a time if necessary. Those who argue that this cannot be done immediately are in fact arguing for retaining the very core of capitalist social relations. If that is done, the revolution is as good as dead. The idea that state capitalism is not capitalism doesn't merely justify support for anti-working class dictatorships like the Soviet Union, China, Cuba, etc., but also creates the very real danger of such a society being created again in future. Support for nationalism in its so-called radical form. Left-wing groups routinely advocate support for weaker, for example, so-called third world nation-states, meaning the governments of nation-states, against stronger ones, such as supporting Iraq in the Gulf War, or supporting the Cuban regime, or the regime in Vietnam or Venezuela, or supporting groups like the IRA, etc. This is described as anti-imperialism, as though the victory of the weaker country would do more than slightly alter the ranking of states within the world imperialist pecking order. Imperialism is a historical stage of capitalism, and opposing it without opposing capitalism itself with a working class revolution is meaningless. But it is definitely the case that all forms of colonialism and imperialism are wrong and should be opposed and resisted. The most common form of this so-called radical nationalism consists of so-called national liberation movements. As soon as they gain power, they always crush the working class. That is, of course, the nature of bourgeois state power. Often the line will be used that even if one disapproves of nationalism, that nevertheless nations have a right to self-determination, and we must support their rights. A purer example of bourgeois democratic double-talk could not be imagined. Rights are not something that actually exist, but are a bourgeois mystification. The working class should not talk about its rights, but about its class interests. Talking about a right to national so-called self-determination, as though a geographical grouping of antagonistic classes can be a so-called self, is like saying that workers have a right to be slaves if they want to, or a right to beat themselves over the head with a hammer if they want to. Anyone who supports the so-called right to something anti-working class is actually helping to advocate it, whatever their mealy-mouthed language. Siding with the working class against all capitalist factions necessitates opposing all forms of nationalism whatsoever. Any wobbling on this will lead the working class to defeat yet again. Support for trade unionism. Trade unionism is another weapon in the devious arsenal of the left. Seemingly the most working class activity of all, trade unionism is above all a movement to reconcile the workers to capitalism. Its stated aim is to get workers the best deal within capitalism, but it's not even that. The mass of workers have bourgeois consciousness, but because capitalism forces them to struggle that consciousness could transform into something threatening to capital. Enter stage left, the trade unions with their slick leaders peddling their good-smelling bullshit with their mission to keep those pesky working-class fangs drawn and fire blanket any possibility of meaningful action against the bosses and the state. The very nature of trade unionism produces anti-working class bureaucratic control. The workers must create new autonomous structures controlled from the bottom up to run every struggle that occurs and to take effective action outside and against the unions if the struggle is to go forward. Left-wing groups' support for trade unions is just one more way in which they help shackle the working class to capitalism. One more appalling and authoritarian trait of the left and leftism, which is of course intrinsically authoritarian, is the advocacy of hierarchical leadership. Whether it's the messianic fantasy of a naked emperor such as Corbyn or Sanders, or the cult of a so-called revolutionary vanguard party. Advocacy of the leadership of so-called revolutionaries over the working class. This division between a mass of followers and an elite of leaders mirrors the divide in mainstream capitalism and indeed all forms of class society between rulers and ruled, and serves well the project of maintaining class relations in social capitalism or constructing state capitalism after a revolution. The strategy of leftist leaders of all stripes is to perpetuate the sheep-like mentality workers learn under capitalism and harness it to their lust for power. However much these so-called leaders claim to act in the interest of the working class, the simple fact is that if the working class does not lead itself and consciously build a new society, it will fare no better than it did in the Soviet Union and China and all the rest. All supposedly revolutionary left-wing groups, whether Leninist, Stalinist, Trotskyist or Maoist, or whatever other cult names they call themselves, are merely capitalist organisations who, if they ever came to power, would erect new state capitalist dictatorships in the name of the very working class they would proceed to crush. This is not necessarily a matter of the subjective intentions of their members. The sincerity of at least some I am not questioning here, but the objective results of their policies and practices. This is why the left has not failed. Its aim was never more than to save capitalism by disguising it as something it was not, just as the original form of bourgeois so-called democracy did at an earlier age. In opposition to the left and the right, there are anarchists. We anarchists or libertarians stand united against the fake radicalism of the left and for a genuine alternative. What is the alternative? We believe, despite the obstacles put in its way by both the right and the left, the working class has the power to destroy capitalism for real and create a society without classes, without the state, national boundaries, oppression or inequality. A society not based on money or other forms of exchange, but on collective ownership of and free access to all of society's goods on the part of the whole of humanity. A society that will allow the full freedom, development, expression and empowerment of the individual. This society is known as anarchism or anarchist communism, or libertarianism or libertarian communism, and would be the first truly free society ever to exist. The social movement that will create this society will grow from the existing struggles of the working class and from the anger and resistance of the discontented. As part of this process, our class must surmount the barriers put in its way by bourgeois ideology, including left-wing ideology. Our task is not to be leaders, but to be part of the process of creation of a revolutionary working class movement that will put an end to our world's long history of oppression and exploitation, and begin the long history of the free world human community to come. Thank you for listening, everyone. All the best.